Well, we officially started 1 minute ago, but I'll hang on a little bit, see how many more people we can attract. Good morning, Ben. Good morning, Simon.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ben.
Dennis.
I already said good morning to Dennis, but he probably didn't hear. While we're waiting, maybe you might like to have a look at this. I'll just find it in a moment and put it in the chat window. Here we are. So could somebody tell me whether that link actually works for them?
Hasn't turned up yet.
I haven't seen anything in the chat.
Ah, I'm sorry. No, yes, it was my fault. I thought I was sending it to everybody. I wasn't. So let's try again. Just a moment. It's coming. Right. So you should now have got a very long link in the chat window.
Seems to work.
Yeah.
Well, shall we? Do these things usually start a little late, or should I kick off?
Probably get started now. I think that's probably about.
Okay. Right. Well, I was invited to manage this, lead it, I don't know, which I did. So I thought perhaps we should start with some introductions, although I think we've got so few people here that you probably all know each other. Then I've thrown together a few slides to get the discussion going. And then I thought that well, we'll see how we get on from that. Shall I just briefly introduce myself to start off with? I'm Nigel Gilbert. I'm a professor of, well, officially a professor of sociology, but I usually describe myself as a professor of computational social science because I'm a computer person as well as a sociologist at the University of Surrey. I'm involved in a range of projects, none of which are explicitly about epidemics or epidemiology, although I do quite a lot of work on things like social networks. I'm the director of the Centre for the Evaluation of Policy Across the Nexus, which is an ESRC centre concerned with improving methods of policy evaluation, and we work closely with government, particularly BEIS and DEFRA, on a whole range of policy evaluation. I think that's all I need to say, probably. Oh, I'm an advocate of, perhaps in some senses, a bit of a pioneer of agent-based modelling in the social sciences. Reading from left to right on my screen, anyway. I'm actually not entirely sure how I pronounce you. Is it Ciara?
Ciara, yeah. No, it's all right. It's an Irish name.
Right.
So I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator at the Isaac Newton Institute. So I know quite a few of you. I did in a past life work in disease modelling though. Spent a year at Public Health England and things. So I've been helping Dennis and Valerie with putting together all the programme and these challenges papers. So
Simon.
Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Dobson. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of St Andrews. I'm actually also the head of school at the moment. By background, I'm a sensor guy, so I work on sensor. I've worked on sensor data analytics and machine learning for sensor data processing, and had a side interest in network science and epidemic processes. And recently, I've just forgotten about sensing and started thinking a lot more about network science.
Hi, great.
Particularly about simulation over networks, but also the effects of topology on the way processes work, processes operate.
Dennis?
Well, as one of a long-standing epidemic meeting organizer with, I suppose, originally particular interest in certain sorts of epidemic models, and particularly relations between different kinds of epidemic models, and trying to take a wide view of things at the moment, as with Valerie particularly sort of co-editing this series. Well, the question I was going to ask him begin with, Nigel, is whether you've had any contact or anything to do with a thing called the Trinity Challenge, which Sally Davis, the former Chief Medical Officer and who's now Master of Trinity, has assembled what looks like a huge consortium to think about future pandemics, and their mission statement does seem to very much talks about data and analytics as a sort of leading approach. So I don't quite know who's actually, it may be early stage for there to be any activities going on under that program, but I wondered whether there'd be people there who'd be interested in our theme of data.
That's a very good pointer. I did get a couple of emails which were very vague about what they were actually intending to do, and having other things to do, I didn't respond, but perhaps your encouragement might make me do so. So I don't know a lot about it.
Well, I mean, they may be just waiting for the applications for their 10 million to flood in which I think they have a deadline possibly in January, sometime like that. So maybe indeed that they haven't really taken a view, in which case I suppose all the more reason why people wishing to push research on the data side of future pandemics should perhaps be forming a queue for the money.
Well, let's see what comes out of our discussion today. Maybe we should have a joint application to them. Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Swallow, a lecturer in statistics at the University of Glasgow. My main research interests are in Bayesian inference, originally in ecology, but I've kind of moved via chemical kinetics into more stochastic modeling for epidemics as well. I work a lot with, as I say, Bayesian inference, either for parameter estimation or model uncertainty, and also uncertainty quantification. Part of the Scottish COVID Research Consortium at the moment, working on, so I've developed some Bayesian inference methods for some of the Scottish models, spatial models that we've used for simulating Scottish kind of transmission and other things like that. I'm also leading the uncertainty quantification group in the SCRC at the moment as well.
Great.
So, yeah, that's me.
Thank you. And then finally on my list is Valerie. Could you just introduce yourself a little? You are on mute.
There we go. Okay. Yes, apologies for being a bit late. So I guess like Dennis, I have long-term interest in epidemic modelling going back 30 odd years, starting with things like HIV, involved in various sort of macroparasite work as well, where the models are a bit different. But basically, my interest is in applied probability, so mechanistic stochastic models, and I've focused primarily on this sort of mathematical biology applications, but also a lot doing hydrological modeling to do with rainfall, soil moisture, and those sorts of spatial temporal processes. So I've got these two strands. But like Dennis, I go back to the early programs at INI and the epidemic models that we did then, and sort of involved ever since.
Great. Okay, so I'm a real newbie. I suppose I ought to remind you that this session is being recorded for GDPR. I should tell you that. But I think that the idea is simply to keep a record for what we're saying. Okay, well, I put together a few slides, and which I'll show you now, just to get to kick things off. Valerie, I also wanted to ask whether you could, I don't think you can see because you were a little bit late. There's a link in the chat window, which I'll...
Thank you. Yes, I can see that now. Yes, I've obviously missed some earlier chat, probably.
It's all right. Anyway, but I wanted to say that the slides I wanted to show you are very much, I'm very conscious that the slides I'm showing you are from the position of a sociologist or a social scientist. And so it's great that we've got a really wide range of backgrounds here amongst you all today, because that means that you can all contribute different points of view. So let me try and find my slides, and that'll be it. And then I should be able to play these. Okay. So I'm starting off from the point of view that what we should be looking at is, as Dennis says, the data challenges in getting data in preparation for a likely future pandemic. And in order to help us, this is what this link is. I thought we might experiment with using a bit of software called Mural, which is like a kind of online pinboard, but we'll come back to that. And we can all do that simultaneously in real time, as it were. So I think you've all done the copying the Zoom from the Zoom chat, so we can move on. So what should we be talking about? Well, the first thing is, it seemed to me, in order to kind of scope the thing, there's two ways of looking at this. First of all, we could say, well, yeah, there's likely to be a whole pile of data that could be useful, even if we're not quite sure how at the moment. And I've given a couple of examples here of the National Child Development Study, which you may be already familiar with. It was basically a study of a sample of children who were born, if I remember correctly, in 1949, and have been tracked ever since. Or the Understanding Society study, which has been tracking households and surveying them consistently and constantly about demographics and opinions. Or completely different, the aerosol dispersion studies, which will tell us about how aerosols disperse, but not necessarily in relation to any particular pandemic or any particular theory. Alternatively, we could say, well, you're just collecting data without having much idea about what we want to do with it is inefficient. What we ought to be doing is thinking about what our theory or our model requires, and then going out and finding the data specifically for that. So, for instance, the current models, I think almost all of the epidemiological models that I've seen anyway, involve some kind of data about social contacts. So that would imply that we ought to be putting a significant effort into understanding social contacts, social interaction, and collecting data specifically on that. I then just jotted down a whole pile, a long list of the kinds of data that we might that might be relevant, and it is actually, to my mind, a really rather long list. And I have only just included the sort of data that I, as a social scientist, would be interested in for the most part. There's obviously a huge amount more. But I think it is probably worth thinking about such a catalogue and seeing what of all of this lot is the most important and what is probably not important. So there's administrative data to start off with. By administrative data, I mean data that's been collected for administrative purposes, usually by the government. In this particular case, for COVID anyway, recorded cases of and deaths and hospital admissions and ICU admissions and so on. But there's a huge amount of administrative data, much of which is currently locked up in government and almost inaccessible to researchers. So, for example, records from HMRC and from Department of Work and Pensions, all of which might be really important if we're looking at inequalities. And there's digital data, rather nicely put as in, sometimes as digital exhaust. There's the classic example of this is, location data from mobile phone records. Again, really difficult to get hold of. There's cross-sectional survey data. There's cohort studies that I mentioned previously, like NCDS or the Millennium Cohort Study, which was looking at people who were born in 2000. There's network data about who meets whom, who interacts with whom, all sorts of qualitative data from focus groups, interviews, observations, experimental data from specific experiments set up by economists or psychologists, for example, and then, of course, all sorts of medical data. One of the issues that we need to consider is timeliness, and indeed one of the motivations for this discussion at all is that it takes a lot of time to collect data, and therefore we need to start thinking about it and collecting it now rather than waiting for when we actually get another pandemic. Although it must be said that I think often people don't quite realize this, that cross-sectional data, cross-sectional social data can actually be collected very rapidly. That I can get an opinion poll organized and running certainly within a week. And there are companies who will do that for a fee. So what are the challenges? Can we be ready for with data for the next pandemic? The sorts of things that I would like us to talk about are, first of all, priorities. I've already shown a huge amount of data could be interesting, but what are the priorities? Data costs money. Who will pay and how can they be persuaded to do so? How do we make sure that the data that we have is not just put in a filing cabinet and forgotten about until we need it, that we actually keep it up to date? And a lot of the data that we need is personal data in the technical sense of the word. It's about individuals. And how do we manage both to use that for research and also manage issues of privacy and informed consent? So those are the sorts of things that I think need some discussion. So what I want to do is to, first of all, catalogue what our priorities for data are, and then ask questions about what data do we need and what are the priorities? Who should be responsible for gathering and curating it? And if you know, we can make all sorts of sensible decisions about that, but how do we actually make sure that the things that we recommend get done? We'll need to persuade, somebody will need to persuade people with money to put that money into gathering data. Okay, so that was just an introduction. Let's have a discussion about it. I'll stop sharing these slides now. Who wants to react to that? And shall we try and put some, start off by putting some slides, some post-it notes on Mural? What data do we need? I just put 3 post-it notes in just to show you what was involved. If you haven't come across Mural before, in order to add a note, you just click on the window and a post-it note will appear. And you can talk at the same time if you're not into multitasking.
I'm not into multitasking at all. I'll write this in a minute, but an obvious thing that you haven't mentioned is how you keep that, well, collect and keep the data in a form that's usable and, you know, across different platforms, enabling people to integrate different data sources, all that sort of area.
Yes.
We have quite a few problems.
Sorry, do you have a specific example where you think that this has proved to be a problem, just to help us?
No, not at all. But I just wonder, I mean, I suppose it's less of an issue when people are collecting it specially, but if you're using pre-existing sources of data, they're all going to be in different sorts of formats, and the extent to which things are usable and exchangeable without a great deal of work to make them so. But it's not an area I know anything about. And now I've lost my little post-it note.
So just put another.
We've certainly had issues with that in other environments with sensor data, for example, where you can get hold of a data set but can't find out what the units are.
Right.
Because the data, and it is one of those things that's really laughable, but the data set, if you use something like CSV, the data set isn't self-describing. It doesn't contain the units or even the descriptions of the columns. So you then have to find 2 files and make sure you've got the right versions of both. We've had some vaguely embarrassing mistakes as a result of that.
That's a really good point. Social scientists have been facing that problem for a long time. There is an ESRC funded data archive which collects, well, it started off by collecting survey data, but it's actually much wider than that now. And that's located at Manchester and Essex universities, and is quite well funded by ESRC just simply to collect data. And of course, they've accumulated a huge amount of experience of how to do that. And one of the things that they, and there are similar data archives in most Western countries, have done is to set up some protocols, about how to store the data with its metadata. So you get over these kinds of problems. It requires quite a lot of work though. And nowadays, if you get funded by the ESRC in order to, and part of your research involves collecting data, then you are actually required as part of the project contract to lodge the data at the ESRC in the format that they like. I'm a bit busy. Sorry.
I don't know if we've been one, so toast or not because she's not coming out.
Oh, you go and talk to Mummy, okay?
No, she doesn't know
Actually, oh dear. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Sorry, yes. So maybe there is some experience there, but of course they deal only with social data, yeah, surveys and administrative data, and but maybe there's some experience that could be applied to sensor data as well.
So I think what you're saying about joining data of different scales is very interesting, and that's an important area of statistics at the moment that is not just relevant here in pandemic modelling, but across all different application areas. You know, I have a PhD student working on that at the moment, for example, and it's not an easy question to answer, but there's certainly methods being developed at the moment that would allow us to be able to do this in a more structured way, in a more sensible way in terms of the statistical properties, and ensuring that we account for any biases in the observation processes that are being introduced by the collection of the data. Something I put on the board as well is I think that the problem with the data is it's kind of a non-stationary process. As our knowledge of the pathogen and the pandemic increases, you know, we start to realize we need more data on different things. So probably what we feel we need to know now is very different to what we felt we needed to know at the beginning.
Yeah.
The models we've been developing in SCRC have had to keep adding extra compartments or extra processes. You know, we now add air pollution as a possible driving factor. You know, we know that there's genetic and race differences between people's responses as well, and different age categories that are important. So I think you know, the suggestions you put right at the start, the demographic data is obviously something that, you know, for pretty much any pathogen we'd be wanting to know, but I also think we need to have the flexibility that we have the infrastructure in place to be able to collect data and respond to that as and when our knowledge increases.
Yeah, are there particular sorts of data that we are very much in need of but don't have?
So again, something else I added was perhaps behavioural data or people's willingness to take risks. I think, you know, knowledge of how lockdowns have been introduced and how people have responded to those. I'm not a sociologist, so maybe those data do exist, but it's something I've wondered about, is whether we could use just assuming that everyone's going to behave in the same way and, you know, follow guidelines is probably not very realistic.
Yes.
How we go about collecting that data, I don't know. That's a very different question, but I think that would be something that would perhaps make the models more realistic in terms of network structures and guidance and following suggestions. And
I think there is some
protocols
on that kind of thing, but of course it's very context specific.
Yeah.
So I was going to raise some fundamental question of that I think we ought to review, or we ought to be reviewing what data for epidemic modelling purposes exists. In particular, what the range, what example, at least find examples of the best that's been done so far, and then to look at difficulties that's had, things that, so there might be, at the time such things were done, there might have been, we would really like to know about X, but the data aren't available. So that would be an example where more is needed. Alternatively, it might be, we're now thinking, we see how important it is to compare different kinds of intervention. And so we need some of the, like the behavioral stuff that Ben's just been referring to, because we need that if we're to assess whether interventions, in other words, we might have brilliant data about how people socially, what the social contact networks look like in normal times, but be wanting to model what's going to happen when we put in an intervention, and then need data that's going to help us do that.
Yeah, I like your example, because it's one of the things that I've seen is that the importance of these social contact matrices and how little data that we actually have on either in normal times or nowadays on people's interactions. I think I'm right in saying that there are actually only two sources of data on social contacts. Tell me if I'm wrong. One is the EU
Polymod.
Data set, which is 2008, and so it's a long time ago, I think. And the other is the BBC 4 pandemic data set.
Nigel, you'll be talking there about large scale, almost sort of universal data sets.
Yes.
My guess is that there will be quite a lot of studies that have looked at data on social contacts on much more micro studies. That I'm pretty sure that there'll be examples, for instance, I think Martina Morris may have talked about this a while back about, I'm guessing the example, I don't entirely remember, but like having say a student community and getting them to keep diaries of and so on, interactions on. So in other words, there have been attempts on a sort of fairly small scale, I suppose, they would be mostly, to do very much modeling oriented data gathering.
Yeah, I think that's true. There are quite a lot of very small scale studies of very specialized groups like students and school children and things like this, which are relatively easy to persuade to do these kinds of things. I personally wouldn't want to use that data as a basis of modeling of epidemics in wider society, because behavior of students is obviously extremely different.
Yeah, no, but that's only one example. I think
my personal view is that what we ought to be doing is running a continuous collection of social contact data over the UK population. I mean, obviously a sample of it, not all of it, but a representative sample, because we know so little about it and because it is likely to be changing as a result of pandemics and other factors, and that we simply don't have that data at the moment.
I have a student looking at trying to pull the university's social contact network out of the data systems at the moment. So look at who's in what tutorials and what classes, because there's so much variation of class size and amount of contact across the different parts of the university. And potentially we can fold in the societies to that as well. But I mean, that will only tell you about potential contacts anyway. It won't tell you about actual mixing.
But I think in modeling terms, what the kind of thing you're trying to do here is to say there's some huge unknown network. What are the key things we need to know about it to see how epidemics are going to spread on it? And there'll be things like the degree of the nodes and the variability of the degree distribution would be a couple of sort of rather abstract things you'll be looking at there. So of course students are very different, but you might possibly have a comparison of a micro scale study of students and another one of, let's call them ordinary people, that and you might come out with the conclusion that typically student networks have a larger degree and greater variability in degree distribution. So it's I suppose I'm thinking that the kind of data you want depend on the kind of thing you're trying to do, whether you're trying to understand how the epidemics work, or then to, having got some understanding of how the epidemics work, whether you're trying to do some sort of large-scale population data gathering or modeling what an intervention in which people make half as many contacts or whatever, you know, that does makes difference to that. But also, I mean, I don't know the details of it, but I mean, again, in the other extreme, the existing thing, I mean, Vespignani, clearly in his sort of agent-based modeling or individual-based modeling, has a sort of model of the world population, which must be making assumptions about contacts, which presumably are based on data. And it would be an interesting question to ask him, I suppose, as to where the quality of data available has been the biggest handicap in producing a good model.
I'm pretty sure that he will be making some fairly outrageous assumptions about the form of the network.
I was going to use the word heroic rather than outrageous, but
yeah, that's a much better word. Yes, heroic.
But then the point is, surely, is to, again, I suppose I'm coming from a sort of modeling background, is to say, you know, what are the key assumptions he's making, which are heroic or outrageous, depending on your choice of adjective, and is there something we could do in the way of data gathering which would enable us to make those accurate?
Yeah, yeah. So what we really want to do is, I'm just going to write a little post-it note, is some idea of the social network structure.
But also, some of these very detailed models, a lot of the parameters and for them are coming not exactly out of thin air, but based on earlier studies, other infections, all sorts of places, and particularly with effects of NPIs, for example, where sort of factors are applied, which do seem to come largely out of thin air. You know, we'll assume that this is reduced by 30%. I mean, obviously they would do sensitivity analysis and so on, but there's an awful lot of places, at least my impression is, where they're not based very firmly on sort of current data.
Yeah, yeah. I think
the model. Sorry, I think the model sensitivity is an important part of feeding back into the data collection in terms of knowing where the models are deficient and where uncertainties could be reduced if we were to collect more data. I don't think, you know, uncertainty reduction isn't necessarily arbitrarily a good thing if we're reducing uncertainty in the wrong direction, but if we can collect data that would allow us to constrain some of the parameters that we're particularly interested in more, then that's got to be a good thing.
I mean, it sounds like a really, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, coming back to that point that you suggested, Nigel, about some kind of social network capturing study, but that's happening kind of at a regular, you know, sort of regularly, so we're capturing changes, and whether we can look to other diseases. So for Valerie might well know about it, for sexually transmitted diseases, they use this thing called NATSAL, the National Attitudes Towards, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, sex and lifestyle. And they update this sort of, they do it every 10 years. I mean, that's maybe not frequent enough. And that's the basis of like global models in any country on sexual partnerships. So it could be that you could use something similar, you know, you could kind of use similar structures that they have in place to be collecting this now for social networks and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned understanding society, which is also done continuously, but that's looking at individual households. It doesn't actually ask any significant number of questions about social contacts or networks, but one could conceivably sort of tack that on, or have a different study.
sorry, I was going to say, how easy would it be to influence some of these regular studies to add extra questions that are relevant and that will be useful for the future? I mean, once a study is set up, are they set in stone, or can they be adapted?
I think they're quite resistant to being adapted because they want to make they want to be able to compare what happened this year with what happened last year.
Sure.
They keep changing the questions, then can't
Well,
do that.
you could add some, presumably, without affecting.
You could, but I think they're also constrained by the amount of time it takes. I mean,
Yeah.
Interviewing somebody for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
You can try, but they will drop out. So I suspect it probably, when one thinks about it, it would be better to start it afresh, but another one. But the trouble is that what I'm really sort of advocating here is quite ambitious, in the sense that the budget would be counted in millions, to do this. We're talking about, I should think probably at least £500,000 a year for however long it takes. So it's not a cheap enterprise. But on the other hand, I mean, we're spending an awful lot of money on all sorts of things.
We have the contact tracing apps that are being deployed at the moment. The Protect Scotland one seems to be doing reasonably well, but I don't know whether we'll actually be able to mine that for network data. I suspect the answer is no.
Yeah.
Or at least not until afterwards with a massive amount of anonymization. But really just getting, as Dennis alluded to, getting the parameters of that network without the details would be sufficient for a lot of things.
That's a very good point, actually. Shall we put that on a post-it note, that we could try and make sure that...
I'll write that while you're talking.
There is actually a sad story about the BBC for pandemic data. I don't know whether you're already aware of this, but they collected essentially the sort of data that we're talking about from 28,000 people. Well, they were self-selected, but even so, it's pretty good. And if you listen to the program, as I did a week or two ago, it's still available on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth it. They keep saying, Hannah Fry keeps saying, oh, well, this data is going to be really valuable because there's nothing like it before, and we'll make it available to researchers widely. So I took the liberty of actually emailing one of the investigators and said, where is this data? And the answer is, it's not yet available, even though we're just about 2 years after the event, because they seem to have got themselves into an ethics problem, that they didn't ask for the necessary informed consent from the participants to make the data available at micro level, even anonymized. So what is available are the social contract matrices of how the different age groups and who meet different age groups, but you can't actually get the data. Tell me if I've got any of that wrong, but
kind of comes onto that another challenge of making data accessible as well in a timely manner, because I've heard from some other scientists that I think there's been challenges getting hold of the test and trace data, which and that's people on SPI-M and SAGE haven't been able to access the test and trace data, and so that would seem like this was back in July when it had started, but I think it was quite frustrating for them. So all their modelling efforts were not actually taking into account any of the test and trace data because they couldn't access it. And so it's having that time system set up so that as soon as the test and trace becomes available, data can be distributed to relevant people who need it to be producing the most accurate and up-to-date information.
Yeah. I don't know how to do that, but I think it's actually really important. Actually, it's a shame that Julia Gog, who I think is part of this whole system, it was actually one of the main investigators on the BBC Four. So I really have loved to have heard the inside story about what's going on there.
Would it be well? I was going to suggest that, but then you'd obviously been in touch with others. But I mean, whether it was worth contacting Julia to find out if there's anything that can be done and what's going on. But presumably, if they didn't set up the right sort of permissions at the beginning, it's all a bit difficult.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, it's not an area I know much about at all, but going through all these ethics things in advance to set up things, unless you actually think through what purpose. I mean, I think my impression is that they would be set up by a researcher for a particular purpose, and you think you've got it all in place. But of course, if somebody decides they want to use those data for some other purpose, they may need to have people to have given different sorts of permissions. And I don't know to what extent you can go back retrospectively and sort that out.
I think it is very hard. And so I think one of the lessons I draw from this is that we ought to find some way of helping those who are engaged in this sort of data collection to sort out the ethical issues rather than leaving them to work it out all for themselves. I mean, some kind of guidance on what should and shouldn't be in the informed consent, for example.
Yeah.
Again, maybe the data archive would be a good place to see whether that already exists. Or I put the link to the data archive that I've been talking about in the chat window incidentally. Okay.
Computer scientists always think that people in other disciplines have got this stuff sorted, and it's just that we're uniquely inept at setting up ethics, because we trip over this all the time.
Yeah.
We've always thought that it was just us, because it's not something that computer science has dealt with historically.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether I'm relieved or not that other disciplines have this problem.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a lot about social networks and data. Should we perhaps go back to what I was saying? What is the priorities? What are the priorities that we should? Is social network data the most important that we should be collecting? I'm sure there are other things as well. Preparing to collect, I should say.
Can I throw a slight curveball in that fits in with something? Well, it's actually what Andy Dobson said, and it fits in with the environment challenge, but it's still related to data. And he was suggesting about how we need to have a database of sort of better databases of all known coronaviruses and all known diseases in bats and all these kinds of things, so that when something new comes along, we can sort of scan the genomes, look at where there's similarities, so we can better predict from a very early stage, is this likely to have a lot of asymptomatic transmission? Is it likely to? So yeah, like having these bigger data.
Yeah, as a social scientist, I do say the reverse to what Simon said. I would have assumed that was already in hand, but by the sound of it, it isn't.
Well, no, I think there are projects to do that kind of thing. The question is whether they're good enough, adequately funded, etc. The other thing that sort of goes on from that is medical data. I mean, imagine that there were medical practices everywhere, and medical practices were reporting on patterns of respiratory disease in their, well, in other diseases, but particularly respiratory diseases in their patients, and the symptoms they were being shown. It might be that you might be able to look at these. It might be that something that's not obvious to someone in one specific medical practice stands out at you if you have the wider data available, and someone monitoring it could look and say, actually, the proportion of respiratory diseases in Southeast Asia showing some particular syndrome is very different from the usual pattern this year. You know, is there something changing about the form of some disease? So in other words, so this is the idea of surveillance, of trying to spot changes in infections that humans are getting from other sources, probably from wildlife, and try and spot the change before it evolves into something with pandemic potentiality.
That definitely is collected on a UK scale. I have colleagues that work, you know, on a daily basis looking at respiratory diseases in Glasgow, for example, where that data, but whether it's widely available to people who aren't working in that field, and certainly on a global level, I wouldn't have thought it was.
Yeah. Well, and the question is whether that kind of thing is happening in Vietnam or rural China.
Good point. Yeah.
Possibly it is. I mean, you know, Vietnam has dealt far better with the pandemic than we have. So I think one, that's pretty. But that question. But I think it would be useful to have an informed opinion on how well that kind of thing is working worldwide, and whether having better funding cooperation. I mean that's the kind of. I mean these are the kind of action. I mean the data gathering that is as specifically connected to disease as that is something one might be suggesting that WHO should be trying to coordinate improvements across the world. Whereas stuff which is just about social contacts is probably.
It has to be national because it'll be
quite difficult, particularly given that we've already talked about the you know, data protection issues. Getting worldwide agreement on collecting some kind of social contact data is going to be a nightmare, particularly if some of the authoritarian regimes leap on it as being a really great opportunity.
Yes, I suspect that if
imagine a backlash in many other countries refusing to have anything to do with it.
Yes. No, I don't think there's any value in doing it other than nationally for that. Yeah. Okay. So what other data do the existing models require? One sort of thinks about the.
Well, they need all the sort of transmission susceptibility type of things, which is more than just the contact data, but actually, you know, linking that to infection, don't they?
Yeah. Is that something that one can collect? I mean, is that very disease specific or not?
Well, it probably is.
Yes.
Is that where it fits into estimation, Valerie? Because are they the things that they often estimate? Because you kind of can't measure the transmission rate per se, because you can't knowingly infect somebody, which is kind of what you need to do. So is that where, like, what data should they be collecting so that they can better estimate that? Like, well,
I guess so. I mean, I was thinking you really need not just well, I mean, you know, in other sort of measles type scenarios or something, you would have lots of household data where you would know, so within a household, within a small group, after an introduction, what numbers of people got, other members of the household got infected and when, which would give you some idea about the sort of infection profile.
I mean, I think it's been pointed out, I think, that I can't remember where the discussion that with contact tracing, you know, if you are contact tracing someone who's caught the disease from someone else, then, you know, well, suppose you contact trace, you find someone with the disease, and in the process of contact tracing, you essentially, well, among other things, you maybe try and find out where they got it from.
Yeah.
And quite often in those circumstances, you have an individual with the disease, and if you talk them through it, you can get quite a good idea of how they caught it. You know, it might be, you know, you might say 80 or 90% probability they got it from some social occasion they went to, but 10 or 20% probability they caught it some other way. But my understanding is this data simply is not gathered.
I don't
So-
think so. And you need, and I think a lot of the time with the contact tracing, my impression is from what people have said, that they're not going backwards. And what you need is to go backwards to see where people got it from, but then from that point to go forwards again to see who else
Well,
was infected from
I'm
that.
a bit surprised because surely, you know, if they one of the likely candidates for where they got it from is going to a particular pub last Wednesday evening, then you really want to get as soon as possible, find out, get on to the people who are in that pub close to them on the previous on that Wednesday evening. So
Well, yeah, but do they follow up to the extent that, I mean, so they go back to the pub, they notify the people that are on that list that the pub has got for Wednesday evening and tell them to quarantine themselves. Do they actually follow that up and see what proportions of those do actually become?
I think that's two very good questions, Valerie. I mean, the ideal data gathering would both ask more questions at the time and also would do some follow-up.
Exactly.
And both of those things would be very useful for understanding the disease, and to an extent they'd also be useful for, you know, the immediate problem of your local outbreak. So
Yeah.
So it does seem to be possible that I mean, contact tracing, let's not get on to the politically loaded discussion of how contact tracing is working at the moment, but let's just talk about, you know, a better contact tracing system should maybe include in its protocols some thought of what data will be useful for if understanding the disease more widely. In other words, try and make people, so, you know, you can quite understand why, if you're a public health official or whoever is doing the contact tracing, you are most immediately concerned with the welfare of the person in front of you and the people whom their connections who may also be at risk of getting the disease or have already got it. But I think you need to point out to them that there's a wider social purpose, so that they could just add a little bit of, you know, one or two extra questions and making and including a follow-up might be things that don't make a particular difference to that particular patient, but are very useful from a general public health point of view. So you could include it. I'm just saying, it doesn't seem to be unreasonable to add a little bit to the protocol for high quality contact tracing. You know, one of the purposes of high quality contact tracing should be to help us understand the patterns more generally. Again, I mean, it's quite possible some other countries do this in their contact tracing. I imagine that contact tracing protocols vary hugely. So
Yes,
maybe
I
looking
imagine
at the
so.
countries that have done best with contact tracing, you might well find, I mean, I wonder what the contact tracing protocols are like in China, for instance. You know, we might not wish to follow them, but they
Well,
might
I
be,
think,
they might
yeah,
be good examples of how much information you can get on these things.
somewhere like New Zealand, I suspect, would be much more thorough in you know, going in all directions. But if you haven't got many things to follow up, it's a whole different ball game, isn't it? So I suspect that part of the issue is the scale at which you're doing this.
Yeah.
I was about to say that the rapidity with which contact tracing breaks down because of workload is a measure of how the disease is spreading. How fast does those contact trees grow? So even looking at whether your contact tracing system's breaking down is telling you something about how the epidemic's growing. One of my colleagues is actually from Wuhan, and her parents still live in Wuhan. And she said I actually asked her about how the contact tracing worked there, and she said, well, it didn't, because this locked everybody up. So you put everybody in their houses, you tell them they cannot leave under any circumstances, and you deliver food to their door. Job done. And she, being Chinese, cannot see why this is a problem. That this is the obviously the sensible thing to do. And the thing is, she's right that degree of lockdown, you then only have to worry about the guys going around delivering the food. So that degree of lockdown was startlingly effective. I'm quite curious as to understanding what happens as you move away from that level of complete lockdown, as you gradually relax things. What effects are those likely to have on the outbreak? Because in a sense, all of these things are just experiments. You release you relax something, what happens? And that collecting data on that as to how different relaxings affected the disease would be very interesting.
That actually raises another completely different sort of data. I mean, in our next pandemic, maybe we should mobilize researchers to follow in real time exactly those kinds of things. Find out, what people are actually doing in real time. I don't think anybody's really done that, have they?
No, and I wondered a way of doing this. It sort of struck me that I don't know whether people have heard of the NIHR Health Protection Research Units. So they were set up back in 2012, and the whole point of them was so that when we had something like a pandemic, there was an emergency responsive element within a number of different institutions, so Imperial 11, Bristol, LSHTM, so that would immediately respond and come together to do modelling for the government. And they have different centres or focus on different things. So one's on interventions, one's on respiratory. But it made me think that there's actually, I don't think there is one focused on data. And maybe that's what they should have had, one that was really focused on if there is an emergency, we will come to help the collection of data and setting up proper data systems. Because just talking about contact tracing, I mean, there was the whole problem that they didn't set up they didn't use good database systems for collecting all the information, and they were just using Excel spreadsheets. So having that support for the government, so that people who know lots about it can come and help is possibly something to think about.
That sounds like a really good idea. Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. Because there are people who are much more experts than any of us, I'm sure, who should be roped into this kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think if we go back to the Post-it board, I've actually just done a little bit of reorganization and colouring of the Post-it notes, so that the pink ones are supposed to be about who is responsible, and green ones are about how to make sure it gets done. And I see that you've already put in something on that, and HPRU that focused on data collection. Who would we have to persuade that this is a good idea?
Well, it's funded by the NIHR, and so they're like the National Institute. They're like the research. They're like EPSRC or ESRC, but for health research. So I guess
do we have any access to the decision makers there amongst us? Anybody in the Newton Institute? Should we just write a paper and write a blog, or how do we manage to get them to take note?
I think they were set up in conjunction with Public Health England. So to actually get one of those, you had to have a link with Public Health England, and that's what links all of them directly into the government. Right. So I don't know whether it's like Public Health England is the way in, or speaking to some of those people, but that was when they were set up, that was their goal. I think it was the idea to link research institutes better into kind of the government decision making, and to have a responsive element. So they do long-term things as well, but I think 30% of their time is specifically funded to be responsive.
Right. So what is that in effect is what's funding what we all know it's happening at LHSTM and
Imperial. I mean, I think probably now they've got a lot more funding, but yes, in the initial stages, and I mean, I think when things like Zika and things have hit, then they're the people who are brought on board and involved in, and I think it's really sort of supporting the efforts of Public Health England, but more widely, so that it can be more up to date in terms of the latest research. So when I spoke to sort of Stephen Riley about how we were coping with the pandemic now as opposed to sort of back when SARS hit, he said things like the HPRUs have been like instrumental in the researchers actually giving direct guidance to policymakers. But I guess when they were set up by people in Public Health England who were epidemiologists and had an interest in that area, and maybe they didn't think about the sort of data side of it.
Right. Yes. And you seem to have worked out really well in a way. The trouble is the PHE is about to stop existing, so it's all very.
Yeah, but I guess they'll just rename it.
Yeah.
I mean, before PHE, it used to be the Health Protection Agency, HPA.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I can't believe it. They're completely going to disband it. I should think they'll just rename it and get rid of some people. But that's.
Yes.
Change gives the illusion of progress.
It's my guess. But when they did that changeover, it cost like millions of pounds. So.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
and that's why we worry about spending, let's say, £1 million a year on collecting social contact matrices, which is actually useful. They spend £10 million on rebranding. Okay, so I've added something along there on the post-it board. What other data does a typical kind of SIER model require?
Well, you need data. I mean, you need information on the excuse me. You need information on the transitions between the compartments, basically.
Yeah.
So and ideally time dependent data rather than viewing those things as constant. So it would be functions of age and time, geography, all those sort of things. So,
But
you can't really do that in advance of the pandemic, can you? I mean, because it would vary between different.
A lot, yes, most of it would. I mean, it's setting up those parameters in the model. And it would be very much, it would be, I mean, apart from overall sort of contact rates, and even that might be disease specific, but all the other things would tend to be specific to the particular infection, I think.
I think there's a whole sort of separate bit of the challenge, which is this sort of real-time early development of a pandemic, trying to make as good estimates as you can. So it's maybe setting it, what one should be talking about there is protocols for collecting data in the early stages of what, as soon as you suspect something's a novel disease, even if it's just it might be a different version of flu rather than something entirely novel, but as soon as you recognize it's not one that's already known, and then you need a protocol for gathering data as quickly as possible to pin down its parameters. Obviously, most crucially, how it's transmitted and if it's transmitted in a number of possible several different ways, what's the roughly the relative contribution of each, and so on and so forth. But also, obviously, things like the length of the infectious period and whether people transmit before or after they show symptoms. Um, and again, I mean, I think it would perhaps be interesting to look back at both this pandemic and others. I mean, to just see what's been done, and if there are obvious improvements that one could suggest to data gathering.
Yes, so that's perhaps I'm going to start a new colour on the post-its of things that we can actually do here.
That sounds exciting.
But that's very, very different from in sort of, you know, thinking about in sort of data set terms. You know, some of the things we're thinking about are we'd like to see gathered at national or even international level across the population sort of data. This is much more about making the best use of an initially very small data set, but which sadly is probably growing rapidly, and trying to trying to make the best of it to get your defences going as quickly as possible in the most effective way. So it's I mean, well, I mean, another thing was essentially, I suppose, in thinking of that, you know, that's not that different from sort of vaccine trials, where vaccine trials traditionally have a very static model. You know, vaccine trials are almost conducted as though you have all the time in the world, that you're really trying to follow the most careful, rigorous statistical protocols. You want to try things out first on animals, then on humans in some limited way to find out whether adverse reactions and so on. And, you know, traditionally developing a new vaccine is something that takes quite a few years, maybe 5 or 10 years, typically, something like that. And, you know, in face of the pandemic, you have instead of the static problem, you have the dynamic one, where the rewards for doing something early are so huge that you are really looking to cut corners wherever that's possible. And you have, obviously you have trade-offs between possibly damaging people with a vaccine which is inadequately tested, and as against getting it out there quickly and saving a lot of lives from the pandemic itself. So so it's another, so I think that so that's rather a traditional field where people are having to rethink how they behave. And we've got a session on vaccines coming up, haven't we, Valerie and Kira?
Yeah.
I don't know if that will touch on this kind of issue of you know, this different approach to vaccine development.
I don't know.
Yes, that sounds interesting, but I'm not sure that it has any. It's not really about data, is it? I mean, it sounds a really interesting topic, but it's probably one for the vaccine session rather than for.
I suppose it's quotes not one for data, because if something is vaccine trial, then it's pretty much intrinsic to that you do collect comprehensive data on it. It's sort of taken for granted. That's part of that. So, you know, it's not something we need to persuade them to gather more data on, perhaps. So I think you might be right there. Whereas the one I mentioned earlier of assessing a new pandemic as quickly as possible. Again, I mean, I think the present example shows sort of good and bad sides. I mean, in terms of data on the virus itself, in terms from early patients and working out roughly how long the infectious period was, and making estimates of the length of time people might be infectious but not yet be showing symptoms. I think on all of those, the performance was quite good. What was much less good was appreciating that the patterns of transmission might be different from what was initially expected. So
Yeah,
so
we
that's-
still don't seem to be very clear about that. It's my
Sorry?
impression. We don't seem to be very clear
Well,
about what.
the WHO was going around, was fairly officially saying that aerosol transmission was unimportant
Mm.
at a stage when it was becoming pretty clear, really, that aerosol transmission was important, if not predominant. So, so I think there's a whole there's a whole part of response to a new pandemic, which is to do with being careful not to let your preconceptions blind you to the data.
There's a whole different issue about data, which is we haven't touched on at all, which is, I suppose you could think about it in terms of transparency. The extent to which the data that is being collected should be made available to the public as well as to other researchers. And we talked a little bit about the issues about informed consents and ethics and so on for sharing research data. But is there also an issue that we should be thinking about making the data available in a comprehensible way to citizens, to the public? At the moment, we seem to be really rather bad about that. I noticed that there is now supposed to be a publicly available dashboard, but I haven't actually been able to access it. But yeah, and the northern mayors are wanting more data, I think quite rightly. Maybe there should be, one of the things that we should add to our list of desirable things is that there should be some project which thinks carefully about what data can be made available and how to make it available in a way that people can understand. Are there any good examples of that you know about of data of this kind being made available in a comprehensible way? And there's obviously the John Hopkins dashboard, which the newspapers use, and I think that's pretty good. But I'm thinking about something more local.
I mean, even then, you're not necessarily getting the data set. You're getting the gloss on the front of the data set.
Yeah, yes, you're getting the aggregation. Yeah, it's really that what I was thinking of. I mean, I don't think the public are going to be wanting the micro data, but at the moment, it seems to be mainly, well, the government has been producing data, but is that good enough?
But I mean, coming back to contact data, I mean, if you, given a situation where you have to have simple rules, which are obviously not, almost bound to cut across common sense, or what the real risks are at some point, rule of 6 or something, and so on. If in the interest of transparency and getting people to cooperate, it would be very good if you had a dashboard that could tell you, even if it's very crude, that the estimates of where transmissions were occurring. If you had, if you were able to say that 30% of transmissions were occurring in workplaces, and in that in Manchester at the moment, let's say that perhaps some large percentage seem to be connected with large-scale public meetings, and some other percentage seem to be connected with household contacts or whatever. I just feel the public, well, apart from being interesting in itself, if there's better data on this, I think that under the theme of transparency, I think the public are much more likely to cooperate if they feel they're being given the facts as to what is dangerous behaviour and what isn't.
Yes, certainly that's been a matter of contention, isn't it? I mean, the people who own pubs say that it's nothing to do with us.
Um,
I mean, in fairness to them, they are worried about being sued. That was certainly a concern for the Jockey Club after they ran the Cheltenham races.
But at the moment, there were arguments in, well, I think in Wales and in Manchester that, you know, closing pubs at 10 o'clock, for example, is a waste of time. You know, that doesn't actually achieve anything.
it's thought by some to be counterproductive because
yes, even counterproductive.
everyone came out of the pub at 10 o'clock sort of wanting to do something else. So, you know, perhaps a lot of them would go off to the local shop and buy something and stand and drink it together somewhere else or whatever.
Yeah. But I mean, is that, yeah, there's no data about whether that is actually the case or not.
No.
We just don't know. Some people say it is and some people say it isn't.
Yeah.
I think there's data.
It's probably a good example of something where there's probably an underlying fairly sensible reason behind it, which is possibly that the drunker people get, the more careless they are, and therefore wanting to dissuade people from spending long evenings in the pub, to having some kind of simple rule that's supposedly implements that, but without perhaps thinking through what's going to actually happen.
It also underestimates the determination of drunks.
Probably.
Which sounds stupid, but I'm actually quite serious. You know, some people do go to the pub with an express intention, and if you give them 2 hours, or if you give them 5 hours, the result will be the same.
Yeah, fair point.
I suppose that we had an infinite amount of funding and an infinite amount of time, and we wanted to know whether transmission was reduced or increased by this kind of curfew on pub hours. How would you do it? Is it, I mean, are we asking for the impossible? Is it actually possible to identify that sort of thing? I suppose with a lot of contact tracing, one might be able to. Certainly wouldn't be straightforward.
You also might have to be willing to introduce an infected person into the experiment.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's what this BBC4 pandemic program did. It was a virtual infection. I mean, I don't know. Do you know how this program worked?
Roughly, but
what they did is they got 300 and something or other people in Hazelmere, which is a small town in Surrey, to put an app on their smartphone, which registered proximity to other smartphones carrying that app. And then they introduced the presenter who was the case zero, who wandered around Hazelmere, and then they monitored all these apps, because it was only 300 and something people, and they were doing it for the BBC, and they managed to persuade them all to get over any consent issues for the purposes of the program. So it was a sort of virtual infection, and then they show you on a map how the infection spread over 3 days. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of work. As I say, it's well worth watching this program if you haven't seen it. It's a really nice piece of work. It's still entirely relevant. And what is really amazing is that it was all done in 2018. Before anybody had any sight of.
Where do we find that?
I'll see whether I can find the link and put it in the chat window.
That'd be interesting. Thank you.
If you just bear with me for a moment. And
One thing that Julia did note when they presented some of that work at a seminar I went to a couple of years ago is that it's probably an overestimate, because obviously when people do actually get sick, a lot of the time you would slightly change your behavior and your contacts would be reduced.
yes.
So that's obviously not captured behavior changes, but obviously for where there's asymptomatic infection, then it does.
Yeah, but it's still a brilliant program.
No, yeah, it's very. But it's interesting talking to Julia about it. She said, I don't think when they did all of that, they ever thought they'd actually be using it 2 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
She said it's a bit surreal, I think.
I found it quite surreal, some of the levels of discussion that have been going on in the media with this. So everyone can now talk about exponential curves and R values and rates and over dispersion, and who would have, had you asked us beforehand if that was going to happen, we'd probably have said no, that the public wouldn't care about it at that level. But clearly they do.
Right, I think I've found it.
So I guess because it's sort of coming towards the end, Dennis and Valerie, what do you think we should sort of going?
Sorry, I'm ready to play now. Anyway, there's the link in the chat window. Sorry. Right. Yes. What should we do? Can we look a bit more at the green and the blue as to post it?
Well, I suspect, as far as the blue is concerned, that the various modelling groups are doing a lot of that within their own models. But whether there's need for anything, and there will, I mean, we are having in other sessions discussions on model comparison and so on, which link to that a bit.
Is there a mechanism by which we could explicitly ask people to think about that, send us the results?
I'm not sure about a mechanism exactly, unless it's called Kira.
Yes.
But I mean, there is an intention in general with these challenges. I mean, we sort of divided the topics up, not exactly arbitrarily, but to some extent we just tried to put things into silos to start things off. And there are a lot of cross-cutting issues, and that is obviously one. So hopefully that can be brought out between the different groups.
I think if
I was going to say,
Nigel, I think if you could, I mean, if you could take perhaps all or most of the post-it text and put it into some kind of reasonably logical order, hopefully finishing up with a list of things that might be regarded as challenges for research or action, that would be a good way to see where we've got to. And obviously there may be, I suppose there may well be good things we've discussed that haven't ended up in a post-it.
Have I got this right? The ultimate aim is to write a paper. Is that right?
Yeah, the ultimate aim of the Challenges papers is to write something which would roughly have a structure of an introductory page or two explaining the importance and problems of data relating to future pandemics, would then have half a dozen or plus or minus specific challenges, which are, and then maybe finish up with a discussion. So the meat of the thing would be specific challenges. So I don't know what a good one, but to I suppose you could have a fairly general challenge. I mean, maybe one starts off with them fairly general and possibly makes them more focused when you decide what the useful points are. But you could start off with an introduction. I think would make this distinction between whether you approach it from a sort of data first or model first point of view, and then specific challenges might be better data for spotting for surveillance of possible pandemics or something like that.
Okay. How I mean, you've also got a very clear idea of what this is going to be. How long would you expect this paper to be? Is it going to? It's going to fit into a series, so presumably you have a.
Well, the example is the set we did, which is in 2015 special issue of the journal Epidemics, which I'm pretty sure there's a link to on the IDP site, but one of us can easily supply it if you can't find it, which will show you what we did then. And it seemed a good clear structure, and it was also very well suited to collaborative working, because usually what you find is, I mean, you might have up to 6 or 10 authors for the paper as a whole, but each particular challenge would usually be, quotes, owned by 1 or 2 or 3 people who would write that bit, and then you obviously need to get together to make sure the introduction, discussion sections bookend the paper satisfactorily.
I'm not entirely sure we've come across we've talked about enough to occupy a whole paper, but I'm sure things will add to what we've written, what we've talked about.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to suggest that why don't we leave the mural? We could post a link to the mural board in the Slack channel, and we could leave it open maybe just over the weekend or something, and we could tell the modelling group tomorrow when they meet at their coffee session,
yes,
and maybe just invite some of the modelers and some of the other groups, if they could just put some post-it notes on of their ideas, and they could just put their initials next to the post-it notes, or put their name and their ideas on the post-it notes, to gather a bit more ideas. And then next week we could look at maybe, Nigel, you can then look at like trying to structure it into, starting pulling them all together into a document that we could use as an initial.
Okay.
Sound a good idea?
Yeah, I hope I can ask you to help.
Yeah, you can ask me to help. And I've posted a link to the special issue if you want to have a look at what the
yes, right, thank you, that's helpful. Yes.
Previous papers, the kind of format for these are.
So if a last look at the post-its, is there anything else that we ought to be doing before we stop? Anything else that is we haven't thought about that I think we ought to?
Nobody's mentioned machine learning, data science. Not complaining.
Well, yeah, no, because I was also wondering about whether it's worth. There was 2 sessions on data, wasn't there, Valerie, at the beginning of September, with I've forgotten. There's too many names. It was someone from Delve, because Delve is obviously doing a lot of the data science type stuff for the pandemic, and it might be worth looking back at those talks and seeing what kind of came up.
Yeah, Frank Kelly was our Delve sort of person, but I can't remember who did the.
No, yeah, it was one of the. Who was the organ? Let me check. But so we could go back and look at those as well, and sort of.
That's a good idea.
And I can post a link to those talks for people.
That's really good. Thank you.
That would be really good.
I'll do that in the Slack channel, and then people can have a watch of those, because they had they had a few people from Delve, and they had some interesting things discussed that would be kind of relevant, I think, to this. I feel like it was another Nigel. Nigel Shadbolt.
Of course, yes, the open data.
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and so because I think he was bringing in the Delve element into that, so that might feed into some of those notes.
Sounds as though ought to be some links there. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So is that a good next step plan?
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, thank you very much for.
Well, thank you for,
Thank you for organising.
yes, absolutely. Thank you for getting it all going. It's
Well, thanks, Nigel, for.
very, very useful.
Yeah. Would it be useful if I sent you a copy of my, or I have already sent you a copy?
You sent me a copy of the slides, yes. So I'll post those in the Slack channel as well. And so then if we use that as a kind of way to collate all the information.
Good.
Yeah, that sounds super. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Amanda, if you're there, would you mind stopping recording?
Yep, no problem.
Thanks, Amanda.